Hello, everybody, and welcome back from your breakout sessions. I hope you had good breakout sessions. I hope you had new ideas. Maybe you noted down a thought. Maybe there was a question that popped up. Maybe you had an interesting conversation with a neighbor. We're now going to continue with our last section of today. SDG number 7, clean energy and financing the energy transition. I think now more than ever, we are aware how important a stable energy supply is, not only for us, but also for our economy. Nevertheless, energy is also one of the dominant contributors when it comes to climate change. According to the UNEP, the sector accounts for 60% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions. So I think we all know that we need an energy transition, and now we want to look at the opportunities and the potential that it holds. And for this, it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator and our speakers of a panel on financing the energy transition. Please welcome with me the moderator of the session, Gebhard Ottacher. He has, in the last decade, founded and led Teach for Austria. He's also prior been an investment manager, startup entrepreneur, and strategy consultant. And in the past years, he's been on a learning journey around climate action and clean energy transition. Please welcome with me Gebhard Ottacher. He's going to be speaking with Olivia Coldray. She's the head of the Energy Finance and Clean Cooking at Sustainable Energy for All, and also the guest research scholar at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, Olivia Coldray. Fabian Kiesitsky, he's the head of corporate development at Wien Energie. Fabian Kiesitsky. Claudio Gligo, he's the head of asset management and CIO at the Bonus Pensionskassen AG. Claudio. And also with us online is Nick White. He's a global head strategic research at Mercer. Hello, good to have you with us as well. Enjoy your panel.
Thank you very much. Now that I have an open mic, I cannot help but make a compliment to the organizers on this beautiful stage setup here. I don't know if you can see that from the back of the room or on your screens, but all of this here is made up of cardboard. Even the chairs here we're sitting on, it's all biomass, and I can say it's not too uncomfortable, is it? Hello, everybody. To this panel on financing the energy transition. The transformation ahead of us will touch pretty much all aspects of our lives. I wish we could fix it with a simple software update, but it is hardware that we are talking about here, and that's why it will take a while to do that, and it will also cost us a lot of money. How will it be financed? Well, we will try to find some answers to this question in the next 50 minutes. Here with me is a panel of experts. They have already been introduced, so at this point, all I will say is Olivia, Fabian, Claudio, and Nick, very welcome to this panel. Thanks for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel. We will follow a simple structure. We will talk a little bit about the challenges that come with this transition. We will talk about the financing part of it. And then we will spend some time on what investors are most keen about, the opportunities. As before, you will have the chance to feed me with your questions through the Slido link, just like yesterday. And I will try to weave some of them in as we go. I would like to start with the basics, though. Fabian, you have a lot of expertise on energy. You even worked at the International Energy Agency in Paris. So help us out with a quick definition of what we actually mean by energy transition.
Sure. Thank you, Gebhard. So when we talk about climate change, the core challenge that we have is decarbonizing the energy sector, as energy is responsible for about 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is next to methane emissions, nitrous oxide, and then emissions that are associated to land use change, and forestry. And if we dig deeper into the energy sector, about half of the emissions that originate from energy come from power generation. This is mostly coal-fired power stations. Then we have about 1/4 of the emissions that come from transport, and they are mainly road transport, be it passengers, the cars that we use in order to go on holiday or to work, and freight to transport goods. Then we have about 1/5 of the emissions that come from industry, to a large part from heavy industry emitters such as steel, cement, chemicals, paper, aluminum. And then the last bit is from buildings, and they're mainly for space and water heating.
And what is it that we need to do now?
So we need to do quite a lot, and there is not just a silver bullet that can magically turn this around. I just mentioned that there are different sectors that need to be decarbonized, and the solutions that we need to provide depend very much on the sector and the conditions that we find in the different countries. For example, if we look into the power sector, we still have 200 coal-fired power stations under construction in this world, and we need to see how can we phase that out. There was a commitment at the COP, but we need to make it become reality. And then we have some other difficulties. For example, in Europe, one of the main difficulties, the heat transition. How can we decarbonize space and water heating, which to a large part is still reliant on single fossil fuel boilers, particular gas?
Help me understand like the very big picture. When we say of 100% of energy we use today, right now, how much of it actually comes from fossil fuels?
That's still the large part. Many people might not know that, but it's around 80% coal, oil, gas that we still use.
And when we say decarbonize, we mean we have to replace 80% of what powers our lives and our lifestyles today.
This is one part, but an even more, at least as important part, is to reduce our energy consumption. This is often something that we don't talk about energy efficiency. How can we still have the same useful energy to satisfy our needs with less energy that we put in?
When people talk about the energy transition, they always mention dates. There's a lot of talk about 2030, 2040, 2050. What? How much time have we got to do this?
That's true. So there are some sectors where we start earlier and some a bit later. Maybe just to give you some numbers. So by 2030, we need to make sure that there's no coal-fired power station being built, that we have a significant phase out of coal-fired power already started. By 2030, we need, in order to stay on a 1.5 degree trajectory or well below 2 degrees, about 60% of all vehicles need to be electric. The sales need to be electric. And when we go further, for example, in 2040, we need to have half of our buildings already retrofitted. This is a huge challenge. In 2040, power generation needs to be completely decarbonized, because there's still some sectors, particularly freight transport, but even more difficult industry, that will take longer in order to be decarbonized.
This sounds like a monumental task, and it will keep lots of people busy. And there are lots of unanswered questions and challenges, and that's what I want to start with the challenges that come with it. Olivia, here in Europe, we are quite worried if we can maintain our nice lifestyle, I would say, but there are lots of people who actually want to improve theirs. And that means usually more mobility, more meat consumption, a higher energy footprint. I understand that there is, out of the 8 billion that we are at the moment, there is a billion people who don't even have access to any electricity at all, large part of that living in Africa. Now, your organization is called Sustainable Energy for All. So it begs the question, like, what are sustainable ways to bring energy to these billion people?
Yeah. Thanks, Gebhard. It's a great question, and as you say, I'm working only in developing countries. Sustainable Energy for All is working with the very poorest people. So I guess a couple of framing issues in the overall discussion on energy transition. As Fabion's correctly said, energy doesn't equal electricity, so many dimensions of energy use. Electricity is one of them. I'd like to highlight clean cooking. So if we sort of ground this discussion in SDG 7, we've got some 2030 targets. Universal access to electricity is one of them. We're way off track, which I'll go into a little bit in a moment. We're also even further off track with the access to clean fuels and technologies for cooking, which has massive negative implications for health, for example, education, other social and environmental benefits. So sort of energy is not electricity, even though we talk about that most in the West. The other is, and as we heard yesterday from panellists, this idea of a just transition. So I would argue that we've failed as an international community if by 2030 we don't bring everybody along with us. So improving lifestyles in the West is one thing, getting basic energy access to the poorest people in the world is another thing. So some of you might know on Wednesday of this week, the SDG 7 data custodians released the latest edition of their annual tracking report, SDG 7, the Energy Progress Report. So that tells us where we are as a global community on basic access to energy. That's pretty sobering reading, and I'd commend it to you. So we've got about 750 million people globally, mostly in Africa and Asia, that don't have any access to electricity, and about 2.5 billion people in the same geographies that don't have access to clean cooking. On a business as usual scenario, the International Energy Agency tells us that we're still by 2030 going to have 670 million people without electricity access and still 2.5 billion people without clean cooking access. So we're miles off our targets here. So sort of really important to ground this discussion in the people being left behind, as well as those that are sort of benefiting from an accelerated transition. I'd also just like to point out, in a developing country context particularly, really good to think of energy as an enabler and not an end in itself. So we talk about connections, number of connections. I think the better question and the important question to ask from an impact point of view is what those connections do in terms of improving people's lives. So, education outcomes, if you've got a light bulb in a house you can study. If a woman is not spending 3 or 4 hours a day collecting firewood for cooking, she can devote that time to other uses. And if a family member gets sick, if they can go to a health clinic that's electrified, that's a good social outcome. So I'll stop. Lots more to say, but I'll stop here.
I'm glad you're raising this point around education, because one point when we talk about the climate crisis that is often overlooked is our collective footprint is growing as we are growing as a population. And the global population has been growing and will keep growing. We are now at close to 8 billion. We'll go towards 10 billion by the end of the century. And a very large part will come from sub-Saharan Africa, because there women still have between 4 and 8 children. And we know that what makes the difference is economic empowerment and education of these women. So is this already thought of as a part of the policy mix in the fight of climate change?
Yeah, great point. So those social and environmental and economic benefits, to my mind at least, haven't been sufficiently quantified to make a good argument to policymakers. So a good next step for us as a global community is to really get the numbers on those outcomes. So, what does it save for a country in Africa, for example, if you don't have so many household air pollution-related deaths from dirty cooking? How do you measure women's sort of better participation in the workforce if she's not spending 5 hours a day collecting firewoods? So there are real tangible benefits apart from the sort of feel-good aspect of it, and we really need to be putting those in front of policymakers to help make the case for investment in clean, sustainable energy in different ways. And I'm happy to say more about how you could do that.
In a minute, I would like to bring in Nick, who has been waiting for us patiently down under in Australia. Thanks for that, Nick. You are the Global Strategic Research Director of Mercer. And on this panel, we are talking about one specific Sustainable Development Goal. It's called number 7, and you can find it on one of the boxes there. I think it says affordable and clean energy. Now, we have been thinking a lot about the clean part, but since February 24th, we are thinking a lot about the affordable part. And we can now see what this price shock is doing, especially to developing countries. We see now countries going into a food crisis because the fertilizer is get more expensive, energy is more expensive, etc. So, Nick, I wanted to ask you, what can we expect in terms of energy pricing? Is this going to go away, or with a switch from fossil fuels to renewables, do we have to get used to high energy prices and ever-growing cost increases?
Well, it's very complicated because we need to think in terms of time horizons when we're answering this question. And of course, the pressure at the moment is what's happening as a result of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, as you mentioned, and the food crisis that's being developed because of that. That is one part of the problem, but that's very much at least we hope, it's a short-term problem. The longer-term transition, though, is something that could have ramifications for prices. There's no doubt about it. It really depends on what clean energy we're talking about. So Australia, we're the world's leader in rooftop solar, and that's an incredibly cheap form of electricity. Once you've made the investment and put it on your roof, you can save yourself thousands of dollars of energy bills every single year. So if that's the destination for you as an individual, then that's definitely cheaper. But of course, that relies on you being able to put the solar on your roof. It relies on you living in a country where that solar is super effective. But the size of the transition, the scale of the transition, and the amount of commodities that are needed in the background to fuel that transition, the build out of infrastructure, the building of wind turbines, the battery technology, etc., that will put pressure on commodities. We've already seen that commodities had risen very sharply. Metals had risen sharply before the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and that's just put further pressure on it. Really, the recent crisis has exacerbated pressures that were already building in the system, to be fair. So it definitely is a big problem. I think we can expect certainly volatile energy prices going forward. I think that's probably, we could say that with most confidence, as opposed to necessarily higher energy prices. I certainly wouldn't take today's prices as an indication of what's to come. Short-term pressures will happen, but it is at least an indication of the type of volatility we could expect. But ultimately, you would hope that what we're looking to achieve is indeed clean, affordable energy for all, because that's what clean energy and what renewable energy, and in particular solar, is about.
I want to follow up with you on the commodities, but before I do that, just for clarification in the audience, people who like to pick accents, Nick is based in Australia, but is actually born in the UK, whereas Olivia is here on stage, but is actually Australian. To pick up on the commodities, as we add battery-powered vehicles, we need more and more commodities to build them, and as we are changing the grid system, we also need more copper, lithium, and cobalt and nickel. Is there a danger of a potential supply problem, that we will not be able to mine all these materials fast enough? Or is that not...
So there is no doubt that the metals and mining industry has suffered underinvestment for some time. And you could argue some of that is related to the ESG drive that's run through markets over the last 10 years. People talk about oil and gas being underinvested as well. But the destination for oil and gas and metals is entirely different in the context of clean energy. So oil and gas, obviously, we've got to phase those out over time, with gas being a part of that bridge, if you like. But metals are desperately needed in very large volumes, scales of 6 times the amount of demand for minerals today is needed to build out renewable and EV technology by 2040. And some of those metals, the multiples are astronomical. So lithium, for instance, is somewhere between 13 times and 50 times the current level of demand. And that's an incredibly wide range. And this is why it's difficult to get a sense of just how bad this problem is going to be. I think it's very clear to say that there's going to be pressure, that we do need to invest in mining, which is not comfortable for some. It's not something that ticks every ESG box. It is actually something that generates higher emissions, but it is something that is needed to reduce those emissions in the future. So I can understand how it's counterintuitive to the ESG purists, but it's so desperately needed.
But it's
but
not
we
going
are
to be
going
on
to
the top
need
of
to
our
mine.
priority list, as I understand.
No, well, I totally understand that. But it's one of those necessary evils, really, that we're going to need to be digging quite a lot out of the ground to fuel this. Now, sorry, I'll go back to the range about the 13 times to 50 times. And of course, what that depends on in the case of lithium is battery technology. Are we going to continue to be dependent on lithium-ion battery technology, or are we going to move into alternative technologies? And of course, this is where innovation will be. But it almost doesn't matter, and you're going to need a distribution of the different types of minerals. But what does matter is that all of the numbers are high.
Yeah.
All of those numbers are high. And of course, what we've seen recently is an increase in geopolitical risk. And if we're seeing minerals in pockets around the world, the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, dominates the cobalt market. Australia dominates the lithium market. They're two entirely different regions with different risks associated with them. There will be, we will need to secure supply of minerals the same way we'll need to secure supply of energy.
I see. There is one concern or even a fear that is recently quite become more and more to the surface, and that is the fear of potential blackouts. There is an ever-growing community of preppers who are preparing for days and weeks of blackouts. We even had a mini TV series on Austrian television called Blackout. So I wanted to ask you, Fabian, as we are ramping down a system that is high on emissions, but also very flexible and quite reliable, and at the same time we are ramping up a system that is more volatile and decentralized, but low on emissions, we have to run two systems at the same time. How big is the risk of blackouts?
So as you rightly say, managing an electricity system that is heavily reliant on variable, renewable generation, the challenge is simply bigger than what we have currently. We see countries with a high share of renewables, solar and wind, Denmark, for example, or Ireland, that are coping very well. There are no regular blackouts. Also here in Austria, for example, we are fairly well equipped with the fact that we have a lot of pumped storage. So will I rule out that we will see blackouts? No. But do I think that we all need to be prepared and buy 10 bottles of water and canned tuna? I would say relax.
How much water do you have in your basement?
My basement is not very big, and as you know, here in Vienna, they can be a bit humid, so you need to be careful what you store.
That's true. And how about the grid? Like we get more and more electric vehicles onto the grid. We will get more and more heat pumps onto the grid. So the demand for electricity is going to rise. Is our grid prepared for that? Or are we making the investments needed?
So yes, these are challenges for the grid, adding more electric vehicles, more heat pumps, increasing the electricity consumption. For example, alone for the city of Vienna, we expect that electricity consumption will increase by 60% from now to 2040. Yes, these are some challenges, and we think that you need to strengthen the electricity grid, but it also comes with opportunities. You can use electric vehicles in order to smoothen the demand. You can charge them when the electricity price is low. You can release some electricity, figure out that about 90% or more of the time a car is not being used, so it can be connected to the grid. And similarly, you can do the same things with appliances or using the thermal shell of the building via heat pumps in order to keep the grid stable.
So you're not too concerned about the grid either?
I think we have a lot of challenges. Personally, I don't think this is the biggest.
All right. I want to remind the audience, you can send in questions, if you have any, through the Slido. And now I would like to move on to the financing part. yesterday at the keynote of her keynote, Katrin Käufer, she used a quite powerful quote I found, and it went something like, "How we allocate our capital will determine our future." How we allocate our capital will determine our future. This question is a lot about related to capital. A report recently published by the McKinsey Global Institute tried to answer the question how much this transition will cost. And they calculated that the transition to a net zero economy by 2050 will cost a staggering $275 trillion US dollars. And that's 275 plus 12 zeros, meaning 275,000 billion US dollars. Or in other words, that translates to 7.6% of global GDP every year from now until 2050. So we are talking about a lot of money, and bring in you, Claudio, because as an asset manager and chief investment officer at the pension fund, you know a little bit about that. More and more investors are ready to put their money where their mouth is and not just talk about sustainability and green, but they also want to invest in green products, in green assets. But at the same time, we hear concerns about greenwashing. We have heard it here at the conference. People talk about a lot about that. What is your experience from your angle with this issue?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I can tell a little bit what we are doing and in which fields we are active, and then we can broaden the universe and then talk a little bit about marketing or something like that. But we initiated 2 years ago a program to invest in infrastructure, and the bulk of this infrastructure investments is renewable energy. So we are investing in greenfield, where plants, solar or wind, offshore wind, are built, and then after a certain time, after 4, 5, 6 years, it depends on the technology behind, they go operational. That's an investment we are doing, and of course we do it because transition means also opportunities. It's not only threats, not only things that you have to be afraid of. It's an opportunity, and of course there's much capital or many investors interested in being active in this field. And there are many investors who are not allowed to be in greenfield. They are not allowed to have project risks, and they will be very willing to buy these plants which have been erected by the first investments, like I told you a couple of minutes ago. So yes, there is, I think investors are very willing. There is much capital interested to be directed in this way. The further step, and that's about impact, it's completely the opposite to greenwashing.
Yeah.
Then because when these plants are ready, then some fossil fuel plants are turned off and they're going to replace them. And the second issue, or the second field where we are active, it's more under the title electrification of the industry, where, for example, ammonia is being produced via green energy, via offshore wind or something like that. And at least a couple of weeks ago, since then, we all know that ammonia is the most important ingredient for fertilizer. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, a very good investment, and just to get away from gas. And we remember in January, before the war with Ukraine began in Great Britain, there have been some issues with gas scarcity, and the prices of gas went up considerably. And many fertilizer producers then stopped producing because the input cost was too high. And so this dependency on gas is not only now in all our heads since the beginning of the Ukraine war, but before. So it's a very sensible thing to do, to have some autarky or to have to reduce this dependency. These are investments. Of course, it cannot be 60% of the portfolio because we have liquidity needs. We act in the interest of our pensioners, of the people who are in. But it's a very good and illustrative investment, just to illustrate our thinking. We, of course, invest in affordable housing, which is important too. And, of course, we have equity and bond allocations like every other investor, where the distinction between absolute green impact or something like that is more difficult.
Now, I will assume that you will turn down some investment opportunities because the return is not high enough.
The returns, of course, if you act greenfield, you have a certain expectation for the return, and we wouldn't do that if it wouldn't be positive for the pension fund, because our duty is to act in interest solely, in the interest of our people who are in our fund.
For obvious reasons, and then that's why I want to bring you in again, Olivia. So whatever will not be picked up by the private sector because it's not a positive investment case, I guess the public sector or philanthropy will have to step up and provide these funds. So how do you look at the role of the public sector and philanthropy in all this?
Yeah, good question again. And again, I'm going to bring us back to the developing country perspective. So traditionally, I would say developing countries have relied very heavily on public finance through development finance institutions like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and bilateral development banks to fund their energy infrastructure of various kinds. So that is one model. Unfortunately, for better or worse, that's been accompanied by a certain type of funding model. So the traditional way of providing electricity in developing countries has been really large-scale plants, mostly powered by fossil fuels, very expensive transmission and distribution infrastructure. So I think, to put a positive light on this, and we've talked a little bit about storage and the opportunity the transition brings, developing countries have a real opportunity to leapfrog and learn from what's happened in developed country energy markets to sort of drive their accelerated energy access and transition objectives. So just to give a couple of examples, I think it won't be a surprise to people in this room that the price of solar PV modules has come down 99% between 1980 and 2012. So that's awesome, and that's why we're having a discussion about transition. If that hadn't happened, if that innovation hadn't happened technologically, we wouldn't be able to have this transition conversation. I'd also say, and Fabian touched on it, distributed energy can be a really good solution to obviate the need for that large-scale generation, transmission and distribution. So we're talking about small-scale solar systems, rooftop solar, microgrids at village level and so on. They're really good solutions, and they take advantage of that modular technology to bring solutions quickly and at lowest first cost to particularly last mile populations and people in regional areas. So, some technology that just wasn't available even a few years ago can now be harnessed for impact. I'd also mention the energy security point that's been touched on. So we're having all sorts of problems in the EU with Russian gas and oil. Australia is having all sorts of problems. So one of the sunniest countries in the world, and we've got a wholesale gas and coal problem. So, there's a real opportunity to sort of, lean into this renewable story in developing countries and skip over a lot of what's happened in developed markets. To come back to the financing question, so what we need is sort of a move away from that old model of financing electricity infrastructure to sort of new models and new instruments that speak to distributed renewables and that speak to these new technology and business model innovations that we have. And it's really exciting to be working in this space. And I'll just give two examples and then I'll stop talking. So we heard from Barbara Buchner yesterday at the Climate Policy Initiative, which we work very closely at SE4All. We do a research series called Energising Finance that follows the money for electricity and clean cooking in developed countries. CPI also runs the Climate Innovation Lab, which incubates good financial instruments. One instrument that's come through that is called the Peace Renewable Energy Credit from an organisation called Energy Peace Partners. So this is a really interesting instrument. So people who are familiar with renewable energy credits, a Peace Renewable Energy Credit is basically a standalone REC with additional social and environmental benefits. So one PREC is valued at 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy. What we've seen in the past 18 months is Microsoft, Google and Block being off-takers for these Peace Renewable Energy Credits. So if you had said to me 2 years ago, those companies would be funding teaching hospitals in the South Sudan and rural electrification in Congo, I would have been pretty sceptical, but that's actually happened. So great innovation. That's new forms of collaboration and new forms of thinking out of the box on instruments. Just one other example. On the clean cooking side, just this week again, there's a fund called the Spark Plus Africa Fund. That's the first impact investment fund globally with a specific clean cooking focus, capitalised by really interesting coalition pension funds, development finance, family offices and foundations. So it's a really interesting mix of philanthropy and commercial capital. That's made its first investment this week in a company called Burn Manufacturing, which is a clean cook stove company in Africa. A really good example of how blending actually works in practice. So Kirsten Dunlop said yesterday, blended finance is important but difficult. Totally agree, but it's really rewarding when it comes off. So if you use grant capital properly at the bottom of the stack to prove a concept and then have larger scale investment capital come in at the end to scale, that's a really good example of what's working. So this is happening all over the sector. Super exciting, and super exciting to have the opportunity to leapfrog in lots of ways what we've seen in developed markets.
We're covering quite some ground today, huh?
We are.
Kirsten Dunlop, by the way, I learned also a fellow Australian. True. I now have a question from the audience here that I would like to pose to you, Fabian. Fabian, you mentioned grid stability is not the biggest challenge for the energy transition. What is in your view, the biggest challenge then?
Yeah, I mean, happy also for my colleagues on the panel to chip in. In my view, it's a potential geopolitical instability that can come with the energy transition. And let me give you some examples. We need to make clear that the alignment or that the perspective that we give to businesses and to customers is followed through. So if we tell people, okay, we would like to stick to a 1.5 degree scenario, that means you can only emit as much as that. You need to build up renewables, and therefore we will need less coal, oil, and gas. But if we don't follow through on that, and the oil and gas companies prepare for a net zero future, and that doesn't happen, then the investments do not come forward for oil and gas that we thought we no longer use. And then we will see price spikes and potential crises as we see it currently due to the war in Ukraine. So that's a possibility, and I think we will see much more price volatility in the future. But there is also the other risk. The more and more we reduce our consumption of gas and oil, the more reliant we become on the low-cost producers. Who are the low-cost producers? That's the OPEC countries, that's the Middle East. Currently we have about almost half of the oil that is coming from that region, and in the future it's very likely that will increase, and then we will become more reliant on even a more narrow set of countries. And maybe last aspect in that point, we will see a transition from being reliant on fossil fuel producers towards those that are, and we've mentioned that before, producing critical minerals. There will be some winners. Australia is probably one of them. There might be Peru, Chile, but there will also be losers, particularly in Africa, the high-cost oil producers there. So this is something that I see as one of the largest challenges. How can we combine energy transition with the geopolitical stability?
I want to go to this who will be the winners question as we move on to opportunities that come with the transition. Nick, from an Australian perspective, now I start differently. I recently learned a new word for my vocabulary. It's called the natural capital endowment. Some countries are equipped with a natural capital endowment that is bigger than others. I believe that Australia has quite a big natural capital endowment. It has a lot of resources, and it has a lot of space, and it has got a lot of sun. Now, Nick, here in Europe, when we think of Australia, we're still thinking coal mines, but I think the times are changing, and I would like to be interested to hear from you. Maybe the new government will also make a difference on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We don't have a great reputation on the world stage as being climate leaders. It's fair to say, but it's interesting. It's almost like the people have been doing it for themselves. So you talk about having natural gifts, and I think what climate change and a need for clean energy has done is never made deserts so attractive. If you have acres and acres of space and acres of sun, they talk about, I think it's global horizontal irradiance, which is how they measure different countries on how much sun that they receive. And it's interesting that the transition to renewable energy can be a real benefit to some of those countries that are naturally very dry. So some of the Middle East countries, we just talked about them potentially being struggling if they're all producing. There's a massive transition they go through, but of course they've got the other side of the equation, which is being drenched in natural sunlight. And of course it doesn't work for everybody, which means you're going to need to be moving that power around. And I think what's interesting, we've got a very big problem to solve. It needs very big solutions and some very big dreams. And I think we're starting to see some of those dreams actually become a reality. So there's a long distance power link being created between Australia and Singapore. So literally an undersea cable is going to weave its way through Indonesia all the way up to Singapore, 4,000 kilometers long.
And
then there's another one
like 1,000 kilometers?
4,200 kilometers. And then there's another one that is proposed for Morocco to the south of England, which is nearly 4,000 kilometers as well. So it's a fascinating world we're in now with the size and scale of the solutions. These things were entirely fanciful not so long ago. In fact, I remember having a conversation with someone internally in my company, and they said that's never going to happen. And now there's hundreds of millions of dollars being thrown at it. It's just the start, and it's at the scoping stage and the research stage, but it's being taken very, very seriously.
Glad to hear that. Now, with such a big change coming up, there will be lots of big opportunities as well. And I was wondering, Claudio, how do you look at that? What do you think, which sectors and which asset classes will benefit over the next decades from this transition? I know it's a big question.
It's a good question. It's a big question. Of course, it depends more on the actors and the companies. I would say it will be more seen that institutions raise their infrastructure allocation. So infrastructure will be the asset class in favor, as well the equity and the debt part. So both parts of the balance sheet. Then it depends, of course, on the companies behind. It's all about companies. The companies adapting and transitioning for their own business model. They will be able to profit from this, or to be able to be alive then anymore. Of course, governments have to do something. Without politics, it's not possible to have this kind of transition. And so, like Denmark is one government or one country that will be compete in a couple of years. I think after 10 years, they will have 200% renewables as energy source. And of course, they are very progressive in politics. And this is, of course, aiding this whole transition process. And I think many of these governments think big because they have plans, and that's public information, to erect artificial islands to produce energy 100 kilometers offshore from the country. And so many countries like Belgium, Germany, Denmark, and others are thinking about doing something like that. And so many suppliers for this plants will, of course, benefit. And so you have to see it company-wise and business model-wise, where the most the change will be needed.
Do you expect new Tesla-sized companies to come up out of nowhere and make the day?
I don't think so, but of course, the suppliers for wind, there are not so many around there. Probably you know the names, so because you need some volume behind just to be in the position to produce and to deliver. And nowadays, of course, it's even more difficult with the supply chains. Perhaps one of the greatest risks at the moment in the medium term.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I want to put one last question to you, Fabian. Urbanization has been a large trend over the last decades. We're already at 55%, so more than half of the world's population live in cities, and that number is expected to grow to 70 by 2050. So cities will have to play a major role in this transition. What's your view on that? I mean, you're here working in the city very closely on energy issues.
Exactly. And it's not that not only that the population in cities will increase, but it's also cities are responsible for the large part of energy consumption, thereby CO2 emissions. So it's not the silver bullet to turn cities carbon neutral, but it's a very important aspect. And I mean, here we are in a city of 2 million people. The city government has come up with a clear perspective of decarbonizing Vienna completely by 2040, but that's a lot of work. That means taking out 450,000 gas boilers in the flats around here, substituting that with district heating and heat pumps, decarbonizing transport via electric vehicles, and of course, increasing the amount of solar and wind that we can produce. Particularly, it will be solar in cities, as for wind there is not much space. And I think the most important part is bring all stakeholders together on this pathway.
It's a hopeful message that we can end on. Thank you. We have to close up. I think we made some progress in answering some of the questions relevant to the subject. What's left to me is to say thank you for this conversation and invite you to extend it further. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Australia. Thank you to the audience here in this room and on the screens. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much also from my side for covering so much ground and having a not only dooming but also hopeful conversation. Thank you once more for this conversation. With this, I go on with our closing session. So, some of you might remember that yesterday at some point we brought out this item on stage and we asked you if you know what it was, and immediately someone knew what it was. It was a time capsule. And we said that in all the conversations that we're having during the Impact Days, we should always keep in mind that we might come up with ideas or thoughts that should not only last here for those 2 days, but that should actually go beyond, maybe be a message that we can send to future generations. And here it is again, the time capsule. And just for you to understand the sincerity of this time capsule will go back to an organization called International Time Capsule Society. Yes, it exists. It will be registered by Mercer and Impact Hub, and it will be then held in a secret location for 100 years. So your messages that will go into this time capsule will actually be stored for 100 years and then hopefully be found by future generations. So in order to find these messages, I welcome with me on stage Mark Mertens, and he will, together with Thomas Winkelmann, they're both from 100 Years School, tell us how we can come up with this important message to future generations. Welcome with me, Mark Mertens.
Hello. I got a call from Alexis because of that 100-year time capsule. My company is called 100 Year School. It's very rare people call because a 100-year thing comes up in their life. It's a pleasure to be here. The last days have been very inspiring, a huge gift, incredible set of connections, inspiration, and a really beautiful community in action. And the key to making the Impact Days have impact and to move the learnings into what Charlie Kleisner so eloquently called deep impact is to take what we've learned into our own lives. And I predict two key challenges from my own life and being at these kind of conferences. One is that the life that's waiting for us out there is the life we left on Thursday, and it's usually not quite as optimistic and filled with so many opportunities and big ideas as what we just experienced. So how do we actually show up in that world with what we were given? And the second piece is that we all are leaving here with more challenges, the awareness of more possibilities. And almost every single speaker gave us a call to action. And I feel a bit overwhelmed with that sometimes because I simply don't have the capacity to follow all these calls of actions, even though I believe in them. So what we're inviting you in here in the last 15 minutes of this conference is to begin to distill what you have received and to filter out what really deeply moves you, what you feel called to from your core to actually bring into the world, one or two things. And my belief is that much of the systemic change we heard about always begins at the heart of the individual and the conviction that's built at the heart of the individual that actually allows us to have the resilience to change these systems. And at the 100-Year School, we use the governing principles of nature as a way to connect with who we are and what we're here to contribute to the world we want to inhabit and leave behind. And we believe that what's needed for a world in which humanity and the planet can thrive is a shift of our relationship to nature. There's only two quick slides I want to show. A shift from the left, the old paradigm, where the self just sits inside of this extractive, exponentially growth-based economy. That's the world I grew up in, where making a profit today was more important than making sure there's a livelihood for future generations. And it led us to a world where nature and society seems to be in decline. We heard a lot about regenerative and inclusive economies, and we believe the way to get to those regenerative inclusive economies is to have the self not be solely referenced inside of the economy, but equally oriented at the natural systems. And this shift in orientation can actually support a shift in our own values or societal values from short-term to long-term, from conquering nature, which has been a stance we've been in for a while as humanity, to realizing we in fact are nature, from doing good in a bad system to actually inventing a better system, from being so individualistically minded to becoming collectively minded. So we've witnessed people making some of those shifts as we generally take them out into nature for extended periods of time to begin to have that experience with nature. So it's probably no coincidence that in a time where humanity mastered to shield itself from nature, that this community is also shielded from nature by at least a meter of brick and marble and windows from the next patch of grass that we could sit down in. But we prepared a short experience for you to begin to touch into some of the magic we usually see when we take leaders out into nature. And I'm going to invite on audio Thomas Winkelmann, my partner, who's dialing in from Athens, Greece. Thomas, are you with us?
I am.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Hi, everyone from Athens. I'm sorry I can't be physically with you, but I will try my very best to be present in this slightly limited medium. So thanks, Mark, for the handover. We have very little time right now, but in this little time, let's create a big space. Indulge me in an experiment, one last one, these last days that I'm sure you've experienced quite a few. We set ourselves a challenge, Mark and I, the other day when this invitation emerged, to give you a glimpse into the power of one of nature's governing principles and to see how that might support you in reflecting on the days that have passed, perhaps a slightly different way. So when you tap into your own knowledge and experience of nature, contend with this idea here. Everything in nature moves slow to medium slow, except when in danger. If you think about that, think about sort of how you've experienced, animals and just natural rhythms. It's sort of mostly true. It's sort of fascinating how that sometimes contrasts with the human-made world that we inhabit every day. Think about that too. Something like healing doesn't happen fast. A wound will not heal in a day. And that's just one example. So, there's no trees and meadows in this room, but nature is nonetheless everywhere, here, inside all of you. So, in the next 2 minutes, I'd like you to close your eyes, take in the music, and pay attention to this amazing thing called your breath. And this is not a meditation exercise. The breath perfectly captures that principle. It is nature. It is nature inside you. And it is your own embodiment of that principle. It's your body the way it's meant to be. So for the next 2 minutes, and I know that can feel so long, it's just 2 little minutes. Pay attention to your breath. Just be with it. Pay attention to it. Okay. Okay, so you can open up your eyes again. Come back. So now turn your attention to this magical time capsule that was just presented earlier on. And imagine someone opening it in 100 years' time and finding a note from you in it. So now think for 5 minutes, we'll give you some space. Think about in the last 2 days, a whisper that maybe has become louder for you in your mind, maybe even become a shout in these last days. What has really animated you? What urgent, significant thing has surfaced or resurfaced for you? What might you do differently tomorrow? What have you discovered or rediscovered that you feel is worth sharing with someone in the year 2122, 100 years' time? What's making you restless, scared about this world you live in today? What's giving you hope? So for those in the room, physically, you can write your note on a piece of paper. And for those online, you can use the Slido. And we'll make sure that everyone's note makes it into the capsule. So I want to thank you for the 8 minutes of your time that you've given us for this little reflection. And you have 5 minutes now, 4 or 5 minutes, to think about that note that's going to go into the time capsule. I'll send you back into the soundscape. And thank you very much.
So as you have your notes to someone 100 years from now, we invite you to come up on stage and drop it in the time capsule, and actually stay up on stage with us when you do it.
May I be the first? So I'm putting my message for the future generations into a time capsule, and I invite all of you to come up on stage and do it like me. And with this, I'm walking off stage, and I free up space for you to come up here. Because in the end, if we want to change society, we don't need one person to stand in front of us. We need a lot of us to actually listen deeply within ourselves to those tiny whispers that have become shouts. And we need those voices to grow and all of us to step forward together into the same direction. And on that way, we might find more people who are just as courageous as we are. These are people that we might want to collaborate with. So that together, we can not only send messages to, but also set actions with, and together create a hopeful reality for future generations to come. And with this, we're ending the Impact Days 22. And I'm saying thank you to our partners, the European Venture Philanthropy Association, Erste Social Finance, Erste Bank, Austrian Research Promotion Agency, Austria Wirtschaftsservice, Vienna Business Agency, Austrian Federal Economic Chamber, Tonique, Vienna Up 22, The Hybrid Stage, and Paper Town. I invite all of you once more to come up with your messages now, and I really hope to see a lot of you again next year in the Hofburg, and the date will once be more June the 2nd and June the 3rd. So thank you so much for being with us, and we're very much looking forward to seeing you again in 2023. Goodbye.